Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Assembly of First Nations Impact Assessment webinar series. This is our first of 5 webinars that we'll be hosting. My name's Andrea, and before we get started, to do some intros, I'd like to turn our attention to Elder Verna McGregor, who's going to do our opening prayer and some opening comments as well.
Oh, miigwech, Andrea. Hello, everybody. Kwe kakina, bonjour tout le monde. Pour un Indigenous, kiragon zibin and donja bawa, dem, shichunim kipanesi. What I just said is I'm from Kiragon Zibi, and Fox is my clan on my mother's side, and Onimki Panesi, which is Thunderbird, is my clan on my father's side. Why we would do that is because our clan system was based on a watershed, and we would come together, and that's why. And Ottawa Gatineau forms part of our traditional lands prior to contact, and we would meet there actually because of that confluence coming together. Because we're known again for the Birch Park canoe, but also, and I do a lot of events, and I always say that, and you probably heard me before. We travel carbon free. But also, too, the clan system was based on a system of land management, and again, too, as well, colonization overturned all that understanding. So I think, too, as well, webinars today are so important with this impact assessment, too, for us as Algonquin. We were also one of the first to meet the newcomers coming down the Ottawa River, also the St. Lawrence too, because we are known as the Amamininawag. Really, we're also nomadic, and there's teachings to that. It's tied to the creation story, and that's also with the caretaking of the land. So, this impact assessment is very important in terms of also sharing information and bringing understanding here, because it was foretold of the times we're in today too as well, and we still have our sacred items that also speak of this, one most notably the wampum belts. So again, to here we are. So that's why we start with a little prayer, and I want to thank Andrea for my little medicine bag with and I have smudged the tobacco inside, because there's teachings to that. So before I talk too much, I'm just going to say a little prayer, because then I'll talk at the end too as well. So miigwech. Ojeni gashkitocha mawandose konshe no go mami kakina pamatsajik denis wa konshe mami ya mazanate sechikan. Shwen mishnon in abigis. Miigwech oje kakina gagishen danoje mam de gen in de kimanan. Shkaki question kaso ninde kimnan wido kwa kakina pamasaje konje nagadwab dan kakina guch ninde kimanan mam de gay nishnabe ki. Migwa chonje kakina etek kishigon kizis to be kisses a shichinang shuk. We don't want an okmas nano je nagadwab dan kakina guchia nibi punk sing seed be saigon kichigagam. We don't kwa get kwa konje nagadwab dan kakina guchia nibi a shich. Migwa chonje Nimishomsa non kizis jinkaso onje nagruaban kakina gujashich pemadsajik. We do kwa kakina ashich we do kwa ganin wagonje nagruaban kakina guj ishkude. Migwech onje na seven kagimijin chimino pemadzian. We do kwa kakina onje nagruaban kakina guj na seven mam de gate. Dashi akusa jik non go mama ya COVID-19 shish kakina akusa win. We do kwa chigiwe da ya shich chimino pamads watch kakina pamads jekonshe and abigis. We do kwa kakina ninjino and dogana nimishom sinan nikokmis nan a shichin don't in his hoshe no go monche ne bashkadak de abadun jishak. A shich we do kwa kakina wesi pimiswajik pumadagejik pumudagejik. Never got the jik me jim with jik kakina guch chiminoy chimino pamads watch and abigis a shich kakina yamitigog mijashki mashkiki kakina kishan danoje. Kacheshkwatnegwe de Simen Kego Gajeman a Doshich Konanochkuchnegwe de Simen, we do kakina mom de gate daji akusa jik, we wisna jik, we giwe jik a shich, mom de gate no goma we me God would jik kagike chi wanaki waje nabigis. Miigwech, 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 yeah, miigwech. What I do is I just say thank you for all of creation, really. I start with the universe and I go around the medicine wheel with the four elements, starting with the earth, also everything that's in the universe, the earth, also the water, the fire, and the air, because without the four elements too, we wouldn't be here. And we were given original instructions to be caretakers here of this earth. And also, I send good wishes to all our relatives, including all the people online here today. And we send good wishes for everybody too to have peace, really. And you help the ones that are sick, the ones that are hungry, and the ones that are in conflict today. So I wish you well, and I say miigwech four times, also to honor the four seasons, the four directions, the four stages of your life here. And we're all sent here to with four assignments, and our assignment today is to come together with this impact assessment. So I look forward to listening. Miigwech, back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Elder Verna. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the territory that I'm calling in from is the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, downtown Ottawa at the AFN office here. And I'd like to welcome you to the first of 5 webinars that we're hosting in this series. The intention is for today to be an introduction and some overview of changes that have happened to the legislative regime that dictate how impact assessment happens, and also introduction to some of the regulatory and policy development proposals that the agency has put forward in order to facilitate feedback from First Nations representatives that can both be communicated directly to agency reps and also potentially integrated into technical submissions that AFN will be putting together in response to some of the initiatives. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I'll share a link to our resolutions that provide AFN our mandate as well as the agenda for today. So the session is being recorded primarily for note-taking purposes. The intention is that the recording will be made available to webinar participants. We're hoping to have it posted on our website and be able to share a password. If not, email it directly to you. I know there's some folks that are still on summer holidays, and so we'll make sure that all the information is as accessible as possible to anyone who wants it. There is translation available, so if you go to your meeting controls at the bottom of the screen, you might have to click more, but there is an interpretation icon where you can choose French, English, or original audio. I do believe that all of the presenters for today will be speaking English primarily, and so if you require French translation, you can select that. And if there's a French speaker, then the folks who are listening primarily in English can choose English translation. Otherwise, it's fine to leave it on original audio if you're able to understand the language that's being spoken. There is also closed captioning available for those who require it, and the link to the closed captioning service will be in the chat as well. For questions and answers, I'd like if webinar participants could raise their hand and speak to questions primarily, because I find that that's the easiest to facilitate. If there is something that you wanted to put in the chat, I can definitely, rather than speaking to it, I can read it, but the translators do require that anything put into the chat that will be asked of presenters be spoken as well. So I can do that, but we just might have to bear with me while I go through all the chat comments. I will say too that all of the materials that have been shared with webinar participants are also available on our website. I attached the agenda and some background documents to the calendar invites that participants received. They are also available on our microsite. The presentations that will be provided today, including the agency's presentations and mine, are available on the microsite. Most of them are already in both English and French, but where the translation hasn't yet been provided, it will be shortly. So let's go on, I think, I'm going to share the AFN resolutions in the chat that mandate this work. And I'm also going to share my screen so I can post the agenda for today. So I believe you're seeing one version. So today we've already had our opening prayer. I've done a little bit of an sorry. We've done an opening prayer and a bit of an introduction to the webinar series. We will be hearing from quite a contingent of folks from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada today. First, we'll hear from Ian Ketchison, who is the Vice President of Indigenous Relations for the Impact Assessment Agency. He'll provide some introductory comments, and then we will go to different folks within the agency to speak to certain file areas that they lead for the agency. If there are clarifying questions throughout the presentation, feel free to raise your hand and I can facilitate those. Perhaps we'll ask the speakers to just pause at the end of each slide and check if there's any clarifying questions. And then we can facilitate a bit more of a Q&A once the presentation is completed. After that, if we have time, I'd like to go to an in-camera session. We'll ask the folks from the agency to depart, and I can facilitate another presentation on key issues for First Nations consideration in the regulatory and policy development and engagement processes that the agency is currently conducting. And then we'll close towards 2:45 and 3 o'clock. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. And just to say too that AFN, I had shared the resolutions in the chat, and so we are mandated to share information with First Nations on the agency's proposals for new or changes to legislation, regulation, and policy, and call on the Government of Canada to ensure that development or changes to reg and policy are done in full partnership with First Nations. The intention of the webinar series is to facilitate information sharing and dialogue between First Nations reps and the agency and file leads for certain regulatory and policy initiatives. We're also in a position to identify and champion any recommendations that come out of the webinar series. And so we will have a What We Heard session at the end. I believe it's scheduled for September 24th, where we will present back any of the recommendations that we've heard from webinar participants over the next 4 sessions and propose how to integrate those into AFN's technical submissions to some of the policy initiatives and policy engagement initiatives that are ongoing. Recommendations are generally not attributed to individual webinar participants, but if participants did in particular want to have a dialogue offline to include any attributions or specific kind of examples to highlight recommendations, I'd be happy to have those conversations. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat right now so you have it up front. So I think with that, I'll turn to Ian, and I believe Daniel is going to share his screen and facilitate the PowerPoint presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Andrea. My name is Ian Ketchison. I'm joining you today from Toronto, traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Credit, Anishinaabeg, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples and home to many diverse First Nations peoples today. Very excited to be here today. We've got a lot. First up, sorry, I did want to thank Elder Verna. Always great to see you and utter your wise words. So I really do appreciate that. And a big thanks to Andrea and the AFN team for organizing this. This is a pretty big sort of period of time for us, very busy period of time on the policy front, as we have a bunch of initiatives that we're going to talk to you about over the next several webinars. I'm not going to say very much. We've got all of our key sort of folks lined up to walk through. But I've been at the agency about 5 years, and this is, I would say, kind of the biggest moment for us over the last 5 years in terms of hearing from Indigenous partners about their perspective on policy and regulatory initiatives that we've got ongoing. So very important series of webinars, and really do appreciate. I looked in the chat, I saw a number of familiar names out there that have joined and are listening in. So good to see your names, and look forward to connecting soon. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Jackson, who's going to take over and walk through some of the first pieces of it. So again, thanks very much, everybody, and talk soon.
Thanks so much, Ian. So we can jump into the first slide here. Start by presenting a background on the Impact Assessment Act and doing a bit of a deeper dive into the amendments that recently passed. And then we'll provide a really quick overview of each of the regulatory initiatives in advance of a deeper dive session that's planned on each of those in the coming weeks. So the Impact Assessment Act, as many of you know, is the legislation along with its regulations that establish the basis for federal impact assessment in most regions of Canada, excepting most of the Northern Territory where the Impact Assessment Act doesn't apply. So it outlines a process for assessing the impacts of major projects. Those major projects are identified in the project list or physical activities regulations. And in addition, sets out a process for reviewing projects that are carried out on federal lands or outside of Canada. If outside of Canada, that's where federal government bodies would be involved in funding them or as the proponents of them. So it's a planning and decision-making tool that's used to assess positive and negative environmental, economic, health, and social effects of proposed projects, which of course includes impacts to Indigenous groups and the rights of Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous participation is an essential part that's built into that legislation, providing for an open, informed, and meaningful process. The integration of Crown consultation and Indigenous participation in impact assessment supports the broader government's commitment to reconciliation by providing tools for effective and meaningful participation, collaboration, and partnership with Indigenous peoples. And as many of you also may know, in October 2023, there was a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada in response to a reference question that was initiated by the province of Alberta, looking at the constitutionality of the Impact Assessment Act and finding that as it was previously written, it was overly broad and infringed on areas of provincial jurisdiction. So amendments were made, which were passed this past June as part of the Budget Implementation Act in order to restore constitutionality of the Act and restore sort of operationability and enforceability of the Act. The overall structure and process steps of the impact assessment process remain largely intact, but a number of sections, especially related to decision-making, were sort of tightened up and clarified to ensure a focus on federal jurisdiction, and I can walk through those in more detail. The decision from the court also really underscored the need for federal and provincial governments to work together towards cooperative federalism. And so I'll also speak to some amendments that seek to enhance cooperation opportunities, not only with provincial governments, but with Indigenous jurisdictions as well. And for those of you who may be engaged in ongoing impact assessments, I'll just mention there were some transitional provisions there to ensure that assessments that were in progress when that court decision came down are able to continue and sort of uninterrupted. So the UN Declaration remains an integral part of the Act. The IAA continues to explicitly confirm the Government of Canada's commitments to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and all of the process steps and requirements for participation and engagement during the impact assessment process remain intact. So those parts of the Act haven't changed. And there's a continued requirement to consider and protect Indigenous knowledge as a part of any study or impact assessment under the Act. Okay, so recognizing this is really tiny font, but you will have a copy of these materials separately that you can review. I'll touch on the highlights and you can at least see those headings that I'll follow towards the left-hand side. So the first three are key decision-making junctions in the Impact Assessment Act. So when projects come into the process, it's through designation, either through the project list regulations, which is section 109 highlighted there, or a ministered designation at section 9. Once a project comes into the process, the next key decision point is the screening decision on whether an impact assessment is required. And then following the impact assessment process, the third decision point is the final decision about the extent of federal effects and whether those effects are in the public interest. So all three of those decision points have been modified to be clear that the focus of the decision is on adverse effects in federal jurisdiction. So the existence, the potential for effects in federal jurisdiction is a precondition to designating a project. It's a precondition to being able to require an impact assessment, and it's taken into account in as the primary consideration following the assessment for that public interest decision. Effects in federal jurisdiction were always a key part of the Impact Assessment Act. The court decision sort of pointed out that as it was previously drafted, those effects in federal jurisdiction were kind of one of many factors set out in the Act, and it wasn't clear how they were balanced with other factors. And so what the amendments do is make clear that first, a decision needs to be made about the effects in federal jurisdiction, and if that condition's met, other factors can come into play. There's also the addition of new factors for the Section 9 designation and the screening decision in Section 16 that required the decision maker to look at the existence of other processes. So it could be federal, provincial, or Indigenous processes that are in place that could potentially adequately address the federal effects, and take that into account in whether to apply the Impact Assessment Act, which is really pointing at is the federal assessment process going to add value above and beyond those other processes, trying to reduce duplication. The final decision at the end has also been divided into clear 2 steps. So first, the minister or governor and council would have to look at the impact assessment report, consider Indigenous knowledge, take into account the results of the assessment in order to assess whether there are likely significant adverse effects in federal jurisdiction, and then look at the extent of significance of effects. So that's the first step, looking at the federal effects. And then secondly, taking into account other factors to determine whether those effects are justified in the public interest. So it's clearly distinguishes that first step focused on federal effects from the second step, which is about sort of balancing the decision on whether to allow the effects. And those factors in the second step include needing to consider impacts on Indigenous rights and any positive impacts on Indigenous communities, as well as any positive contributions that the project might have to sustainability and positive contributions to Canada's environmental commitments, and in particular in respect of climate change. Finally, an amendment was made to the ability of governor and council to extend timelines. previously, those extensions could be for an indefinite period, whereas now the extensions can be done once for a definite period with reasons posted by the Governor and Council, and those reasons continue to be broad enough to include the need for additional Indigenous consultation, for example. So moving into the green headings, the definition of effects within federal jurisdiction was amended to more clearly align those effects with the heads of power under the Constitution. And so here there's an important difference between activities that are primarily regulated by provinces, so that would be most mines, provincial roads, or electricity projects, where the court was clear that in order for the federal assessment regime to apply to those types of projects, there need to be effects on federal heads of power under the Constitution. And so the definition is aligned with those constitutional heads of power, including fish and fish habitat, aquatic species at risk, migratory birds, transboundary water and marine pollution, as well as impacts on Indigenous peoples. So the sections dealing with impacts on Indigenous peoples haven't changed substantively from what they were under the previous version of the Act, but there is a new threshold that is added across all of those types of effects, requiring that the effects be non-negligible in order to trigger application of the Act. That's really in direct response to comments from the court that looked at the previous definition, which referred to any change to components of the environment or any change to health, social, or economic conditions of Indigenous people. And the court said that's just too broad and it could result in the Act applying to even trivial effects. And so that was the language the court used, was that it would be unconstitutional to apply this in situations where effects could be trivial. I'd say the project list has always been scoped to apply to major projects that I think by any standard would not have only trivial effects, but this threshold of non-negligible has been added to be clear that there's a sort of minimum bar that needs to apply. Then for federal activities, so that would be interprovincial pipelines, nuclear projects, federal ports, interprovincial rail projects, so projects that are federally regulated. There, the definition of effects within federal jurisdiction is broader and includes kind of all non-negligible environmental or socio-economic effects broadly. Finally, in this last row, amendments made to enhance cooperation mechanisms under the Act, including more flexible substitution provisions. So, whereas previously the substitution required the minister was able to substitute the process of another jurisdiction if it met a list of criteria in the Act that essentially required that other jurisdiction's process to align with the elements of the federal process. All of those criteria remain in the Act, but what's changed is that instead of fully substituting the process to that other jurisdiction, there's a new option where the minister could substitute for the other process subject to an agreement with the federal minister, where the federal side could retain certain criteria or certain elements of the impact assessment process. And as long as those criteria are met by some combination of the jurisdictions, substitution would be possible. And so those provisions could apply to provincial jurisdictions, but also Indigenous jurisdictions. And then finally, an amendment that is clear that Indigenous or provincial jurisdictions could enter into an agreement to participate in an integrated review panel. So those are assessments that occur with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission or the Canada Energy Regulator. So it would be the Impact Assessment Agency, that federal regulator, and then the possibility of a provincial and or Indigenous jurisdiction participating via an agreement. Okay, so I,
Sorry, before you move on,
Mhm.
Sarah, can we
Yeah.
go back to that last slide?
Yeah.
There was one question in the chat, and then I'll just ask you to highlight a couple more things. So
Sure.
the question was, by who and how will effects be considered non-negligible? Is this a determination made solely by the agency, or is it done in partnership with First Nations?
So at that non-negligible threshold applies in two places, one at the designation stage and then at the screening decision. So it's really at the outset of the process. When it comes to designation, the decision there would be the governor and council if it's the regulations, or the minister if it's ministerial designation. So that would be the sort of final decision maker on designation, but it's taking into account engagement with Indigenous communities, which would happen in the case of a ministerial decision on designation, or engagement through the project list review, which we're currently doing, which would inform the regulations. So it would be informed by Indigenous views, and then even more so when it comes to the screening decision, that's an agency decision on whether the impact assessment's required. So agency is the sort of who would determine that the non-negligible threshold's been met in that instance, but again, would be informed through Indigenous engagement in the planning phase.
Thank you. And for folks online, one of the things that AFN has done is a submission to the Senate committee on the amendments when the Senate Environment Committee was considering the proposed amendments to the Act contained with the within the budget implementation bill. One of the recommendations that our submission had made, and a continued point of advocacy, I believe, is that it's inappropriate for the agency to make a determination that impact to First Nations rights are insignificant, particularly where the First Nation has taken a different position. And so I'll continue, I think, to ensure that those determinations are made in partnership with First Nations through that early engagement process that you spoke to. I'd wonder too if I could get you, Sarah, to speak to the changes to the public interest decision, where the decision maker is able to consider positive contributions, but not necessarily negative impacts. Can you speak to that change?
Yes. So again, that was kind of indirect response to the court that looked at the previous language and the factors that were outlined there, and the court directing that it would be unconstitutional for a federal decision maker to consider effects outside federal jurisdiction, adverse effects in a negative decision. So in order to prohibit a project from going forward or impose conditions, those decisions need to be based squarely on effects that align with the constitutional heads of power. And so broadly, sustainability, encompassing kind of broad environmental, health, social, economic effects that are involved in a sustainability determination, that would be outside federal jurisdiction. But if there are benefits that are really about a decision to allow the effects in federal jurisdiction because there's some broader public interest, that's appropriate and constitutional for the federal government to consider. So what those amendments have done is, when it comes to adverse effects and sort of reasons to prohibit the project, those are squarely federal. And then the second step, the positive contributions to sustainability or positive contributions to climate change, if it's going to offset higher emitting sources, for example, it's really the positive side of the the ledger that can be taken into account when the project is otherwise provincially regulated. If the project is a federal undertaking, so the pipelines, nuclear, federal ports, the broader suite of effects, including kind of the health, social, economic, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, all of those would be encompassed in the first step, looking at federal effects, and then you'd be thinking again just about the positive in whether there's justification there.
Thanks for that. I was also hoping that you could highlight under cooperative federalism the new ability to substitute processes or regulatory approval processes other than impact assessment or environmental assessment, and the potential that that be used to substitute provincial regulatory approvals processes and or First Nations own assessment or approval processes.
Great question. So you're right that it refers to the process of another jurisdiction. It doesn't necessarily specify environmental assessment process or impact assessment process. So it could potentially be other types of regulatory processes, but the key is that the criteria would need to be met under the Act, which include assessment of all of the factors set out in Section 22 of the Impact Assessment Act. So whatever combination of processes apply, all of those can need to continue to be assessed. It's unlikely that a provincial permitting process would consider all of that. And then opportunities for public participation and Indigenous consultation are also criteria that need to be met. So it could be, for example, that there's a tripartite agreement with an Indigenous jurisdiction, a province, and the federal government, where the province assesses certain environmental effects. The federal government retains a Crown consultation role, and the Indigenous jurisdiction assesses other effects that combined meet all of those criteria. And then following that assessment, there would continue to be separate decisions by the different jurisdictions under their own legislation, but based on this kind of coordinated single assessment.
Thanks, Sarah. There's one other question in the chat, and for participants, feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand. It's important for everyone to understand the implications of the amendment, so we want to take time to do that. Matt General from Duncan's First Nation asks, has the agency arrived at a final view or position in respect to the application of the court decision to the provisions of the Act related to regional assessments? In the aftermath of the decision, I understand that the agency was thinking that deciding to undertake a regional assessment constituted a federal decision. Thus, those provisions within the IAA remain and still remain as a tool available to all parties.
Yes, great question. And so I think it's Matt is correct that there was some uncertainty about the impact of that court decision on any decisions taken under the Act. And so there was a pause in making determinations about whether to require new regional assessments during that interim period of October to June. We included transitional provisions in the amendments to provide clarity that any regional assessments that started in under the old Act continue kind of uninterrupted. And then in terms of responses to requests for regional assessments that were paused, those will be responded to kind of in, I'm not sure the status of them, but I think there was the time limit sort of restarted once the amendments came into force in June. So there was a pause there during the interim period, but regional assessments continue to be a tool within the IAA. That pause is over. So the requirements to respond to requests are kind of reinstated. Any ongoing regional assessments continue. So as of June, yes, that continues to be a tool available for all parties.
Thanks, Sarah. Was there any other questions from participants, particularly on the amendments and this slide? And I'll just note too that on our microsite under the August 27 webinar documents, this slide is available as a separate document. It's titled IAAC placemat, and I put the link in the chat previously if anyone didn't catch it. I'll just pause for one more second to see if there's any questions on this slide and the amendments placemat. Okay. Seeing none, let's maybe go on to the next slide, Sarah, and if it's the next person in the queue, maybe have them introduce themselves.
Yeah, great. I'll hand it off at this point, I think, to Thomas.
Yeah. Hello, hi, I'm Thomas Joe, Director of Indigenous Policy at the agency. And I'll speak a bit about what we're calling co-administration agreements and give you a bit of intro on what that session will look like a bit later. But essentially what we're talking about is the agreements that are set out in Section 114 of the Act and how those type of agreements would authorize the minister to enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies to take on certain powers under the Act. Under these agreements, Indigenous governing bodies would be considered jurisdictions, and that is what is really the topic of discussion in our discussion paper. Before those agreements can be in place, we do need regulations in place. So first step we did is try to unpack what this could look like. And because we didn't have all the answers, we worked with a circle of experts made up of Indigenous members, as well as experts recommended by Indigenous organizations. And we co-developed a discussion paper to unpack this, put in some concepts so that when we do have this discussion on what this can look like, we have something to refer to and to continue to kind of chart what this could look like in practice. So this discussion paper has been posted online for comment, and that comment period, as you'll see a bit later, goes until October 28th. And that is really what this section would be about. What I'll also do is I'll pass it on to Mary, who's also on the call, and she can also speak a little bit more about the work that was done and what these agreements entail as well.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm Mary Nemeth, Manager of Strategic Policy within the Indigenous Policy Division. I'll talk a bit about the discussion paper itself. So the paper identifies co-administration agreements as this new tool in the collaboration toolbox. It's optional. All the other collaboration opportunities under the Impact Assessment Act will remain in place. The agreements would be long-term rather than project-specific, and because they're long-term, they would bring greater certainty about Indigenous jurisdictions' roles in the future IA processes. In the paper, working together with the circle, we explore how co-administration agreements could work in practice. So this is a federal process. The timelines, the processes under the Impact Assessment Act are still mandatory under co-administration agreements. There are decisions to be made throughout the federal impact assessment process, from planning through to the decision-making phases, and we explore how those could be shared, which of those decision-making points would be of most interest. I really want to emphasize that this is a discussion paper. We like to think of it as a diagnostic. It identifies options and considerations. So we recognize we don't have experience yet building these new partnerships. We very much want to hear from you on how we can work together to make this new mechanism work. We look forward to talking to you more about this discussion paper in more detail at our meeting on September 17th, sorry. I'll pause momentarily if there's any questions before passing it on to Patricia for the next slide.
Yeah, I wonder, either Thomas or Mary, I wonder if you could speak to the kind of background for how Section 114 was incorporated into the Impact Assessment Act. I guess just note for participants that this was a new provision in the Act. This is something new in the Impact Assessment Act as opposed to SIA 2012. This ability to enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies to have those Indigenous governing bodies step up and administer decisions or powers within the impact assessment regime. And maybe just a little bit of the history about how we've gotten to this point already, noting that there were some First Nations who have been calling for the enabling of these agreements through the adoption of the enabling regulation as far back as 2018, 2019, during the period where the Impact Assessment Act was adopted. If there's anything else that you wanted to add to that kind of summary. I asked a question, but then I provided a lot of the information.
Thomas, did you want me to take that one?
Yeah, you go ahead, Mary. You continue.
So just so a bit of background, the Act came into force in 2019. It said that these agreements made these agreements possible, that regulations need to be in place. You're right, it has taken some time. There was engagement right after the passage of the Act, policy around policy development, implementation on a number of issues. That early engagement informed our thinking. We worked with the Indigenous Advisory Committee and talked to national Indigenous representatives and others about sort of how a process for moving forward. We landed on this idea of the circle of experts to really bring in perspectives early in the policy development process. We began meeting with them in June 2022, so it has taken a bit longer than we anticipated. Part of that was a pause during the SEC engagement, through the engagement around the amendments to the Impact Assessment Act. But it's also, I think if you look at the discussion paper, there really are a lot of policy issues to address. A lot of these are addressed in the paper, sort of. What are some strategies, for example, for addressing where co-administration agreements should apply? Like, what should be the boundaries of these agreements in areas where there is a history of shared use and occupation, for example? So the discussion paper identifies some options and categories of options for addressing these issues, but we really feel we want to talk directly to rights holders and hear ideas for how to address these challenges. So it is a bit of work, and we appreciate that there is interest in moving ahead with these. We are committed to moving ahead with them, and I'm really looking forward to hearing ideas on how best to do that.
Thanks, Mary. And I will just note for participants too that it's my personal reflection that the co-development paper really does a good job of setting out where the agency and the circle of experts, who is made up of individual Indigenous peoples, not necessarily representative of an organization or committee, but it does do a very good job of setting out where their opinions or differences are as such. If there's agreement between the agency and the circle on certain issues, or if there's something that the folks on the circle of experts has identified as important, but the agency hasn't necessarily taken a position on, it really does a good job of that. And so I would encourage webinar participants, if you're going to go through the discussion paper, pay particular attention to the recommendations of the circle of experts and any places where they've advocated for a certain kind of recommendation to be adopted. I do find that they've been very thoughtful recommendations, and so like to acknowledge the folks on the circle of experts for that work that they've done. And I do believe that we might have a representative from the circle of experts join us for the presentation that will focus on the co-administration agreement reg and policy approach September 17th as well. I hope to maybe just Thomas or Mary, your reflections on the co-administration agreements as a tool to enable Indigenous governing bodies, and so First Nations or groups of First Nations, if they choose to organize themselves that way, administer parts of the Impact Assessment Act. And so it's powers and duties and functions of the agency or potentially the minister, as opposed to a whole-scale recognition of First Nations inherent jurisdictions and assessment processes that First Nations take on within their Indigenous legal orders to identify whether they want to provide or withhold free, prior, and informed consent. So perhaps just your reflections on the distinction of those two kind of tools, we'll say.
Yes, I'll start. Yeah, that is something that you will see throughout the paper is the talk of jurisdiction, the talk of how far we go on decision making, and what areas of the process that we would share. And as far as you bring up a good point, Andrea, when we see the areas in the paper where the circle have a position and we may have a position, and how it relates to the work we do, and that is really specific to when it comes to jurisdiction. And when we look at the paper itself, when you look at some of the concepts and where we landed on the paper, it is just that it is a concept paper on how this could look, how these can work under the context of the act. But it also, you raise a point that was definitely a topic of discussion in the development of the paper. And we anticipate it will be something that we'll continue to talk about as we work through this under the context of the co-administration agreements. Mary, anything you want to add to this? I know you were linked a lot more closely in the development with the circle. And if there's anything you want to add to that context.
No, I think you covered it, Thomas. I think, the circle itself addressed this, and to Andrea's point, they set out their views that they're about the importance of Indigenous-led assessment separate from the federal process. The one thing I just wanted to add is that the Impact Assessment Act before and under the amended act does require that if there is an independent Indigenous-led process or assessment, that it must be factored into the federal process, so it must be considered. But again, to your point, and I think this is also made in the discussion paper, that this, we want to be clear and transparent about what this is. So the co-administration agreements is about co-administering the federal process, and that is different than a completely separate Indigenous-led process. Sorry, one last wrinkle to that is that although the act must be the requirements of the act must be met, the policies, the guidelines around how it's implemented could be guided by Indigenous processes.
Thank you. And I wonder too, if I can just ask you to speak a little bit about the agency's interpretation of what powers, duties, and functions could potentially be covered by an Indigenous co-administration agreement. In particular, because it's not in the discussion paper, reflections on the Section 9 designation decision as one of the powers that First Nations could take on, and also things like monitoring and follow-up as well.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, so the Section 114 says that the co-administration agreements can authorize powers, duties, and functions in relation to impact assessments of designated projects. So that would be from the planning phase through to the decision-making phase. The designation of projects would happen before an impact assessment starts. So that's why I'm saying that it wouldn't apply to the decision to designate, and it's in relation to the impact assessment. So it wouldn't apply to things that happen after the decision-making phase, so enforcement and monitoring, for example. There are other mechanisms for participation and partnership after the decision-making, but this particular tool, co-administration, would relate to the impact assessment process, which would be from planning through to decision-making. The Act specifically excludes the Section 16, which is the decision about whether an assessment is required. That's the only specific power that's excluded. And then obviously the discussion paper is looking at, exploring what would be of interest, in what circumstances, and how the other decisions throughout the process could be shared. And that's part of what we're asking about now.
Thank you. And I think just before we go on to the next slide, just to flag for participants as well, that in previous submissions, AFN has recommended that the understanding of powers, duties, and functions that Indigenous governing bodies can and should take on not be narrowed any further than the specific exemption for the Section 16 designation decision that already exists in the Act. And I do think that First Nations will have particular interest in ensuring that they have significant input into designation decisions under Section 9 of the Act, in particular because, as we'll hear, there are proposals to narrow the scope of what's on the project list, and thus what gets assessed based on the designation. Based on the listing of projects on that regulation. So perhaps we can move on to the next slide unless there's anything that Mary and Thomas you wanted to add.
Nope, nothing more right now. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea.
Great. I think that's me next. Okay. Cool. Thank you. So my name is Patricia McKay. I'm a manager in the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Division at the Impact Assessment Agency, and we're responsible for reviewing the physical activities regulations, which is commonly known as the project list. This list the regulation came into force with the original Act in August 2019. And the Act requires that we review the project list within 5 years of its introduction, so this year. The list identifies activities that are considered designated projects. So similar to what Andrea was just mentioning, this is one of the mechanisms that makes projects subject to the impact assessment process. And it aims to focus on major projects with the greatest potential for adverse effects in areas of federal jurisdiction, as Sarah mentioned, so that they can enter the impact assessment process. It's a way to provide clarity to proponents, investors, the public, and Indigenous groups as to which projects are subject to the Impact Assessment Act and its process. So the objective of the review is to ensure that this policy continues to be met and that there's clarity around the terminology and thresholds as to which projects are coming into the door and should have an impact assessment. It's also being reviewed through the lens to align with those legislative amendments that Sarah outlined earlier in the presentation. We gathered early feedback throughout the last year and a half from expert federal departments, key internal implementation experience within the agency. So that was analyzing designation requests, trends, as well as trends in decisions under Section 16 on whether or not a full impact assessment was required. We gathered feedback from, we reached out to national Indigenous organizations such as AFN, key stakeholder industries, the provincial counterparts as well, to gather some of that early feedback.
the Technical Advisory Committee under the Impact Assessment Act, as well as the Indigenous Advisory Committee under the Impact Assessment Act as well. And so all of that has culminated into a discussion paper, which we published at the end of July, and it identifies options that we're considering for amendments to the project list. And all of those, so those considerations after this comment period would be rolled up into a report to the minister of recommendations and conclusions on the review of the list and recommendations on what we would actually change in the regulation down the line through the Canada Gazette process. So a further opportunity for consultation down the line as well for any of those changes. We're asking for feedback by September 27th, and we'll get into more details about the scope of the review and how we arrived at potential options outlined in the paper at the September 3rd meeting as well. We'll dive into this with AFN at that time.
Thanks, Patricia. Sorry, I was slow to put the link to the discussion paper in the chat. So let me just do that. Discussion paper on project list. I see that Jamie Sanchez has a question. Can we unmute Jamie and allow him to speak to the question?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, sorry, thanks. I'm Jamie Sanchez. I'm with Nodelay Within First Nation, located in North Central BC, just west of Prince George. With respect to the ongoing kind of feedback being sought here by the federal team here, I guess there's two things. One is, are there capacity resources for nations to contribute here? Seeing you're looking to engage with the rights holders and appreciate AFN's work and the circle of experts and all that. That's my first question. And then the second piece is related to the consistency with the UN declaration with DRIPA or UNDA and the UN DRIP. Like to a little bit more clarity on what that means and who's involved in that work federally.
Thanks, Jamie.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
Thanks for the
Patricia.
So for capacity, we did have a funding call out, and we provided funding to, I think, around 57 groups earlier this year to participate in this process. And then there would be further capacity, I think, for the consultation periods once the regulatory amendments are, if there's any, well, once the regulatory amendments are proposed. So through that Canada Gazette process as well. And then the second question was around UNDA. So UNDA and the UN Declaration are integral into the Act. So that remains part of the process for the Impact Assessment Act and of regulations. So it's always a lens which is being reviewed through the project list. So really that's about understanding what impacts on rights, what projects have potential for impacts on rights. What we've heard, that's through implementation experience as well as through trends and designation requests, and whether or not the list is meeting the objectives of, capturing those types of projects with the greatest potential for adverse effects in areas of federal jurisdiction. And that includes impacts on rights.
Thanks, Patricia. I will note too, so AFN has received funding to support these kinds of engagement sessions on the regulatory and policy changes that the agency has proposed through the policy dialogue program. Our main contacts for Our funding are Janice Zeitz and Daniel Ducharme, who's online here. I'm just going to ask Daniel, can you put your and Janice's email in the chat? We have heard from the agency folks that they had done an initial call out for funding through the policy dialogue program for capacity support for the regulatory and policy engagement that's currently happening with the 2 discussion papers, and then the updates to the regulation on exclusion from the federal lands requirements as well. And that initial call out is being relied upon to support capacity for First Nations. But there is an opportunity for one-on-one kind of discussions if there's First Nations who are looking to receive funding that don't already have that in place. And so I just encourage you to reach out to those folks. And I know it's not necessarily up to me to decide who gets funding or not, but really encourage anyone who is interested in supports to provide inputs to at least have that conversation. Patricia, can you speak to the timeline for the review of the regulation?
Yeah, sure, great. So we published the paper on July 30th, and we're soliciting comments until the end of September, so September 27th. This is part of the review that would feed that report to the minister on potential recommendations, at which point we would then draft some regulatory changes and then have consultation through Canada Gazette, which would be a further opportunity. Probably we're targeting early in 2025 for regulatory consultation period through Canada Gazette Part 1.
Thank you. Did anybody else have any questions on the 5-year review of the project list at this point, particularly like the I see Michelle Edwards has her hand up, so maybe we'll call on Michelle next to ask a question, but particularly about the discussion paper or the timeline for feedback or anything potentially contained within the discussion paper at this point, but just noting that the project list and the 5-year review will also be the subject of the next webinar that we're hosting on September 3rd as well. Michelle, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good morning. Michelle Edwards. I work with the Statliam Chiefs Council, and we're located on Statliam territory, mid-Fraser in British Columbia. And so I'm assuming this act, because it's federal, is right across Canada. But I do feel that in British Columbia, where we have 204 communities, that I guess the consultation and even the capacity that is needed would be a little bit different, because our lands are, our boundaries are kind of shared areas of responsibility. The wildlife, the water, everything is crossing through each of our communities. I always say that the salmon that swim up the Fraser actually get to and have been blessed over the years to actually hear about 30 different languages spoken as they're making their journey, once they're born, and then once they return to their spawning grounds. And so I wonder how that's actually factored into some of the capacity building and the funding that you're offering, because the conversation has to happen with the communities, and then of course then you've got nations. The Statliam Nation consists of 11 communities, right? So I just wonder how that, because I will say it's a little bit different because we have so many communities in BC. 36 different languages are still spoken here. So a project will probably impact us And some will be in very similar ways, and some will be different aspects, depending on how we use the land and how the land actually gets used, and not just by us, by the land itself and, you know, the land community, the one that provides for us. So I thought I'd ask if that was any different, because I see that it's different. Thank you.
So a bit of context, which I'm not sure if it will actually directly answer your question, but there is, when we did the call out for funding, I mean, all of those funding applications were, it was a call out and then they were accepted, and there was representation across Canada. We did note that there was, you know, they weren't all coming from one jurisdiction or one area. And so there was funding allocated across the country. And then just to put in context, so there's this funding for this opportunity to review the project list and then potentially any regulatory changes in the future. But on a project specific basis as well, there is funding opportunities for impacted communities, and that would, you know, through that lens, as well as what are the rights that are being impacted in the specific situations of groups. I don't know if that adequately responded to your question, but
maybe if Michelle, if you wanted to follow up, you could raise your hand again. But I think what I'm hearing from the last couple of questions is that there's folks online that are interested in providing recommendations on the project list and engaging with the discussion paper that perhaps haven't received funding, and also just a concern that they're relying on a kind of previous call for funding. It doesn't necessarily support all of the communities and nations who would want to engage on this subject. I see Jamie's hand up. Jamie, did you want to interject as well? Go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I think too, part of at least the situation for some of us, I know for the community I work with and their partners with neighboring First Nations, there's a strong interest to see a First Nation-led assessments, including one that's possibly coming next year. And it may or may not have a bearing on federal jurisdiction per se, but generally the need for acknowledgement of a First Nation-led assessment, being that we're gonna uphold their jurisdiction to do this within their territories. So I guess it's, and I know it's kind of a curveball on in this presentation, in these workshops for federal assessment processes and legislation, regulation, and all that. I just looking to understand a bit more, if possible, how the new regs and legislation will acknowledge and recognize and support the implementation of First Nation-led EAs and their conditions and all that. And then the second part to this is, has there been any thinking done when a First Nation or an Indigenous governing body, sorry, just on that alone, is there a definition for what that looks like? Or what Canada is expecting or legislated or in regulation on the IGB?
Thanks, Jamie. Really important points. I'm not sure who from the agency would like to answer, but I'll just say on the question about Indigenous-led assessments, we have heard that there is some funding allocated through what the agency has called pilot programs to adequately fund those First Nations-led assessments, which we've heard is one of the things that's lacking in the current kind of requirements and funding portfolio. So I'm hoping maybe Ian, you could speak to that.
Yeah, great. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So on the first, I'll take the first question in terms of Indigenous-led assessments, and then I can pass it to Thomas and Mary on IGVs. Great question. And I think we're kind of working at two levels right now. We've got the broad policy initiatives that we're talking about in terms of the co-administration agreements and the physical activities regulations, and they're working through. And we're going to want to hear from folks all across the country on it. But there's a different sort of circumstance that we often find ourselves in, which is we have a project sort of at the door in front of us, ready to go for an assessment. And when we launched our consultations on those processes, we are very focused on what is it that we can do to maximize the role of Indigenous nations in the assessment itself, and what are all of the opportunities where we can move kind of at the pace and intensity and speed of First Nations that want to conduct their own Indigenous-led assessments. And as Andrea was saying, we are able to unlock the funding necessary to do that. And we've had some really great examples across the country where we've really had First Nations in the driver's seat in leading on assessments, whether it's with the Cree Nation government. We've done a lot of work. We did some great work a couple of years ago with Victagong up in Northern Ontario. Great work in BC with a number of nations on some recent projects. And those are really, once we have a sense of the project that's proposed, then we'll work with our Indigenous partners to figure out the best way for them to exercise leadership in it. And as Thomas and Mary were saying, the regulations on co-administration kind of unlock another sort of level. But we do have tons of tools available to us to really hopefully be able to match the extent to which a First Nation wants to lead on an assessment. Maybe I'll pass to Thomas in terms of Indigenous governing bodies and the definitional parts of all of that. Thanks.
Yeah. One thing that I'll just add too is, from the agency perspective, there's numerous ways where, Indigenous groups, First Nations can participate in the process. And we talk about the co-administration agreements. It is one additional tool, in addition to, what we talked about with Indigenous-led assessments, as well as one other way to participate. As far as the Indigenous governing bodies and jurisdiction, that's covered at length in the paper, as well as determining, or at least highlighting that there needs to be a process to make that determination, how to ensure that the Indigenous governing body reflects right holders, etc. I know there's other models that the government has with other pieces of legislation, but one thing that was clear in the paper was in that regard that there, one thing that we're also looking to get feedback on through this process is what could that look like to make that determination of what constitutes Indigenous governing body. Mary, is there anything you wanted to add as well to this question?
Just very briefly, so there is a definition in the Act itself. An Indigenous governing body is a council, government, or other entity that is authorized to act on behalf of an Indigenous group that is recognized under Section 35. So that's the definition in the Act. We do talk about this, the circle sort of explored that a bit in the discussion paper, and I'll highlight maybe page 27, 26 and 27. So we're talking a bit there about, the circle was talking about the importance of understanding eligibility in a way that recognizes Indigenous jurisdiction and right to self-determination, and that we minimize hoops to jump through, that sort of thing. But there's a bit more discussion of that in the discussion paper. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. There's a question and comment in the chat from Shane. Shane, if you wanted to indicate your last name, you could do that as well, but not necessary. He says, I'm curious to learn more about how projects being pursued by the provincial government, for example, the multi-billion-dollar irrigation project in Saskatchewan on Lake Diefenbaker. There has been a lot of concerns expressed by FSIN about the impact on First Nations rights. Shane says he's admittedly here as a neophyte and the questions may be addressed in the materials. but as unfamiliar, so hopefully somebody can speak to it. With the impact on the Saskatchewan River Delta, the largest inland delta in North America, the province is still moving ahead on this without realizing the impact assessments already done. He's concerned about secrecy and unsure if the agency or the policy regulatory changes being discussed here are considering those issues. I'm wondering if there's a focus on how projects such as these that impact our traditional territories and water systems, even our ability to farm downstream of the irrigation project, can be compromised. Would an Indigenous-led assessment be possible for a project such as this? I'm wondering, maybe, I don't know, Ian, if you have any specific information on the province of Saskatchewan's Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project, or if you're in a position to speak to it, but perhaps the question about whether a First Nation or Indigenous-led assessment is possible for a project that is proposed by the province is something that you could speak to.
Yeah, great, thanks. So yes, I am aware of some of the proposals from the Water Security Agency in Saskatchewan. I've had some good conversations over the last year or more with Sienna and others at Wildhouse Capel and some folks at FSIN. And this is why the review of the physical activities regulations, the project list is important, and feedback is important. My understanding of that project is phase 1 of the project would be below the thresholds that would permit the impact assessment agency to undertake an assessment of it. And very deep, and Patricia could help me out here, there's a threshold, and when a project is below that threshold, we don't conduct an assessment. And so it really is to the province to undertake that work. I can't remember the thresholds on water diversion projects. My understanding is that there had been some sense that the second phase and third phases could trigger a federal assessment. In that instance, if it did, we would have the tools available to move forward with an Indigenous-led assessment. But at this point, we've not heard plans from the province in terms of their plans beyond phase 1, and there has been some media coverage lately, and we have been following up with the Water Security Agency to understand it better. But that is an important point in terms of getting feedback, because the physical activities regulations contain the thresholds above which we would get involved at the Impact Assessment Agency, and if so folks have comments regarding that, then that should be part of any feedback that you provide. So hopefully that helped a little bit. Not a great answer, but that is the latest that I've got on my end. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. And it does raise an important question too. If we're in a circumstance where there's a project that doesn't meet the thresholds for the project list, so won't receive impact assessment because it's not considered a designated project, and perhaps there's a designation request that is rejected by the minister. Is there an opportunity for a First Nation to do its own Indigenous-led assessment? And is there any mechanism for the Minister of ECCC to recognize that First Nations-led assessment, even where the agency hasn't triggered an assessment?
Yeah, so in our world, we have to meet one of the thresholds under one of the mechanisms for becoming a designated project. So either being captured under the project list or as a designation request where the minister decides to designate a project. If we don't meet either of those conditions, then it does fall to other jurisdictions, typically provinces, to undertake the work, and we don't have an active role. That being said, there are many projects that are non-designated projects that do require federal permits and authorizations, and so there's interactions that folks might have with DFO or ECCC for other permits, but we do require one of those, either the project list or a designation request for us to be involved.
Thank you. Before we move on, were there any other questions or comments at this point about the 5-year review of the project list? Again, noting that this will be the subject of the next webinar that will be hosted next Tuesday. Okay. Seeing none, let's move on to the next slide, and I believe that Kevin will be speaking to the next portion.
Great, thanks, Andrea. I'm Kevin Blair. I'm a manager at the agency, responsible for projects on federal lands, for the team that provides support on those projects. So just to start, in a way, is sort of have to shift our headspace here from thinking about the Impact Assessment Act and designated projects. I think people, rightfully so, tend to think of these larger projects that would get assessed, and thinking about the project list that we've just talked about, which is a list of projects that would be included, or potentially included for impact assessment. What I'm going to be talking about is the designated classes of projects order, which is being amended. And the part of the Impact Assessment Act that's related to that order, it's basically it's just a kind of a subset, a standalone subset of the Impact Assessment Act, if you will. And it sets out the requirements for only non-designated projects that happen on federal lands or outside Canada. So it's a different sort of discrete subsection, I guess, of projects out there happening in the world, or happening in Canada rather. So just to clarify a couple of things. So federal lands, just to give some examples of what that includes First Nation reserves, are considered federal lands, national parks and other parks managed by Parks Canada Agency, and Department of National Defence lands. Those are also federal lands. So there are some other examples too, but those are some key ones to keep in mind. So projects, and so these could be a range of projects, could be large undertakings, could be sort of electricity generation if it happens, but it could also include, installing a park bench or a sign or a short fence. Those are all considered projects under this part of the Act. So anyway, these parts of the Act basically requires when there is a project on federal lands and when the federal government is making a decision. So either when they're undertaking the project themselves, when they're giving a permit for a project or giving funding, there's a requirement to examine the project and determine whether there could be significant environmental effects from that project. And so the way the Act is organized, it's basically any activity on federal lands would require some kind of an evaluation of whether it might cause environmental effects, including even if you were just touching up paint on the outside of a federal building, for example, or replacing a light bulb inside a building. Technically speaking, that would require a determination. So that's where the designated classes of projects order comes in. And just moving to that second bullet, the reason for having this order is to exclude classes of projects that would only have insignificant adverse environmental effects. So it's trying to remove a requirement to look at environmental effects, specifically having a process for it, remove that for minor routine projects. And so it's subject to other conditions. But the order basically lists a series of different types of projects, so about 50 of them, straightforward projects, such as smaller buildings, some lighting systems, fences and telecommunication lines and other things, and looking and saying, okay, for those kinds of projects, a determination would not be specifically required. So again, this is not talking about impact assessments. This is talking about a separate environmental effects and determination process on federal lands. So we are basically there are proposed amendments to this order, and basically because there are a number of determinations that are still being made. There are about 1,000 projects on federal lands, about 1,000 assessments that are, excuse me, not assessments, determinations that happen each year. And some of those cause only insignificant environmental effects. So I'm proposing to amend the designated classes of projects order so that those can be excluded, so that basically time and effort can be spent in areas where there would be more potential for environmental effects. The proposed amendments, they are including, so the amendments include, they add new classes of projects, they change some of the existing classes of projects. So just to give a sort of some high level examples, I know this is kind of obscure, and we'll certainly go into more detail on September 10th in the session for this regulatory initiative. But there are, so buildings on First Nation lands. So currently there's a threshold, it happens to be 1,000 meters squared for projects that could be excluded. The proposal is that well-known, well-understood types of buildings, sort of cultural centers, schools, medical centers, that kind of stuff, those could be excluded from requiring a determination under the Impact Assessment Act up to, say, 1,500 square meters on developed land. So it couldn't be forested area that you're doing that in, but that's an example of one of the proposed changes to try to, because on the understanding that on developed lands, 1,500 square meter building on First Nation lands would be expected to have insignificant environmental effects. On September 10th, we'll get into more of those details and how insignificance is determined. But I just want to stress for now that the text of the amended order and some more plain language text is posted on the Canada Gazette Part 1 website, which it's available for comment until October 10th. And there is a link to the place where you can review the proposed amendments and provide comments. If you have, when you have the presentation, we've got a link there. It's also a variety of spots on the agency's website. And if you just go to the Canada Gazette website, you can easily find where the regulations that are open for comment, and you'll find ours there as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about, first of all, the different federal authorities that do environmental effect determinations that might be of interest to First Nations, particularly ISK's process for environmental effects determinations on reserve. I'm wondering if you could also speak to kind of any engagement with ISK that was done to identify the classes of projects that are being proposed or amended for exemption to the federal requirements, any recommendations that ISK had provided about what should or shouldn't be assessed on reserves, and also just the kind of proposal for your joint presentation with ISK to the topic specific webinar that we'll be doing on September 10th. And then
Sure.
maybe speak to that, and then Jamie has a question in the chat too.
Sure. Okay. No, that sounds good. And great point about, so on this part, so for these types of projects on federal lands where this process applies, the obligation falls to federal authorities, federal port and airport authorities. So that's basically federal departments. So Indigenous Services Canada, Transport Canada, Parks, Environment and Climate Change Canada. anytime they are involved or making a decision related to a project on federal lands. So, so the agency's role is to provide support to those groups. And by the way, also Crown corporations, they're involved there as well. So there are over 70 entities, if you will, that who these obligations fall to. So, Indigenous Services Canada is a major player on these. So on reserves, Indigenous Services Canada would typically be involved, and they have a decision to make on the various projects that might happen on federal lands, whether that's housing developments or other buildings, whether it's so utility infrastructure, so hooking up electricity, hooking up water connections, sewers, or roads, or anything like that. These are all projects that may require a determination. And so now I can't speak in detail to Indigenous Services Canada's process, but they have a robust process that sort of, even if the Impact Assessment Act requirement wasn't there, they have this process for considering environmental effects and other things as well that they undertake or ensure is undertaken for projects that they're responsible for. So when the Impact Assessment Act requirements are there as well on federal lands, that all gets incorporated into their process. And so on September 10th, we're working with Indigenous Services. We'll be providing rather a joint presentation. So agency will be able to speak sort of more generally to federal lands processes and the requirements, as well as the proposed amendments, and then Indigenous Services Canada will be able to speak more in detail about their process and things they consider and how they run it, how they engage people, and their considerations, I guess, related to the amendments. So, and in terms of how we've brought ISK and other authorities into the process here, we've engaged with authorities over the last couple of years in terms of understanding whether there are project types that they're doing regularly and know very well, where they're having to make a determination where in fact the potential environmental effects of those activities that they're doing were actually, just are insignificant, are very, very routine, very common mitigation can be applied, etc. So Indigenous Services Canada was certainly part of that process, and we've been keeping authorities in the loop, of course, about what proposed changes have been made, and we received comments from authorities on proposed changes and made other changes as well, and now we're at the point here where proposed amendments are being made. But now this comment period that's happening on the regulatory changes, the whole intent is to hear from Indigenous peoples and the public and anyone who wants to provide comments on the proposed changes. And so we have this comment period, which often for regulations, it can be as short as 30 days, but we have a 75-day comment period to try and enable a greater participation from those who are interested in doing so.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'll just read Jamie's question. So how are cumulative effects determined to be part of criteria and classes for this order?
It's a good, great, thank you for the question. So definitely consider cumulative effects in looking at individual classes of projects. So just to underscore the ministerial, so we call it the ministerial exclusion order, this order, it lists classes that would only have insignificant environmental effects. So again, low risk, common, straightforward, routine mitigation. So these classes of projects would generally have the potential a low potential for cumulative effects there, but that's the whole point is to look at the projects and make sure, could there be any potential interactions with the environment that could be, are worthwhile looking at. So for example, just to provide some context, in the order, even before you get to the list of projects, there's a series of, we call them general limiting conditions, but they're basically a hurdle that you'd have to get over to exclude your project from making a determination. And it looks at things like, does the project have an effect on water? Would it affect wetlands? Would it change the way a water course is aligned? Does it release deleterious substances? Would it affect species at risk? Would it affect migratory birds? And if the answer is yes, then you can't be excluded. So that's an important part, even though a project might actually be listed sort of if you're, I don't know, if you're building a small fence. If in doing that, you are, affecting a water body or disturbing species at risk or whatnot, then you cannot be excluded, and you would have to still undertake an environmental effects determination. So that's part of it. And also I wanted to outline that although this is a list of, a series of different types of projects, the intent is your whole project needs to be basically defined by that whatever is listed in one entry on the list. So for example, if the ministerial exclusion order is saying that a certain kind of building is allowed to be excluded, we would not have to do a determination. If the project is actually building a building and sidewalks and parking lots and a series of fences and a bunch of other things, that can't be excluded. So that also helps avoid cumulative effects. These are discrete entries so that individual projects like installing a bollard or installing an EV charging station, or could be a small parking lot, or could be, some fencing, all subject to other certain conditions. If you just have a small individual project, then you could be excluded. So I think all of those pieces have been taken into account to try to address cumulative effects.
Thanks, Kevin. Are there any other questions on the federal lands environmental effects determinations or proposed changes to the designation or designated classes of project order that exempts projects from those requirements at this point? Jamie, I see your hand up. Can I call on you to speak to your question?
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Thanks. So, is it feasible that a nation seeks, because like this issue of cumulative effects is a big one for at least I know for Noddely Within in this part of the world where there's already significant cumulative effects in the region that are affecting rights to access either wildlife, ceremonial spaces, wild spaces, all that. And just trying to understand a little bit more what mechanisms there might exist related to cumulative effects generally, because yeah, there's a death by 1,000 cuts that have been going on already, and the baseline is not good for anybody. when it comes to either forest ecosystem health or even water quality, and it's affecting the fishery and then the Chaco River. I guess yeah, I just trying to understand if there's space for that and what kind of space there is for that.
Well, and certainly welcome and encourage any comments that you and others may have on the proposed amendments. Of course, that is the whole point of having the comment period. So in terms of cumulative effects, certainly when there's a determination process, I guess a key thing to keep in mind is, and we'll get into this more in the session of September 10th, there's a whole range of projects from small to large that have to go through an environmental effects determination process. And this order doesn't touch those. It could be, and even things that I'm just trying to think of, so it could be, longer, certainly longer, actually almost any kind of road, a variety of energy generation projects, could be even just longer fences. As a matter of fact, those would still have to go through a determination process. And what we're talking about in the order is these sort of the lowest risk, I think, possible projects and types of projects, as long as they don't affect species at risk and water in certain ways and migratory birds and other things. So there are a bunch of limiting conditions. So I think the opportunity for, looking at the potential for cumulative effects of the things on the project, of the things on the order, on the designated classes and projects order, is certainly to look at the proposed amendments here and to see if there are particular types of project classes that you think, well, I don't know if I don't think that's small enough. I don't think that's low risk enough. We definitely want to hear that feedback. But in terms of the processes, like, for example, ISC's processes on reserve lands, I understand that is part of what is looked at, is what would the potential cumulative effects be of this project, and that does need to get evaluated. So that is definitely part of the overall federal lands, I guess, evaluation regime. Cumulative effects is a key part of that. And then we've also, in looking at projects that have the lowest of the low potential for impacts, the potential for cumulative effects has been part of that evaluation as well.
Thanks, Kevin. I think at this point we've got about 11 minutes left together. What I propose to do is just go to, I believe it was Thomas was going to speak to the last slide or two on the next steps in our kind of webinar series that we've asked the agency to attend and present on. And then I just have a couple more housekeeping items, and then we'll go to Elder Verna for a close. Maybe just before we do that, I'll note a comment in the chat. Dorothy Navu, apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly, agrees with Jamie Sanchez. There's already several drinking advisories for First Nations people who can't consume or use the water. And we know how high the suicide rate is from, in part, the quality of life in First Nations with no safe drinking water. The last thing that we want to see is more communities added to this list due to cumulative effects caused by mining, and I assume other activities as well. So thank you, Dorothy, for that comment in the chat as well. Thomas, did you want to speak to the last couple slides quickly, and then I can just do some housekeeping for the next sessions?
Yes, definitely. And I wanted to thank everyone for listening to us today. Further to the, I guess the discussion we had today per initiative, we will be diving in a bit more detail into each of these initiatives on the dates below. One thing also to note is that the dates are staggered as far as comment periods or deadline. All have the same start date, but the deadlines have been staggered to help us plan and help yourselves kind of schedule your time as well to find which session works earlier or later, etc. So this is what we'll be participating in the upcoming month as we dive into each of these in a bit more detail, and looking forward to receiving that feedback on these topics.
Thank you. And thanks to all the folks from the agency that have spoken today, and all the participants who raised really thoughtful questions and comments. Hoping that you all can tune into the topic specific sessions that are coming up. I will just note I wanted to provide space for those kind of question and answers today. There was some topics that we didn't get to that I could facilitate a additional kind of webinar series. The PowerPoint presentation that's from AFN that is on our microsite, in addition to providing some of the background information that you've heard here, also addresses Indigenous-led assessments and regional assessments, as well as consistency with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so what I propose to do is plan a second kind of part 2 to this webinar series that can address those topics. And we'll look to schedule those as well, and want to be able to provide space for folks to hear and provide recommendations to the project list, the 5-year review, the designated classes of projects order, and also the Indigenous co-administration agreement, regulatory and policy approach, which will be happening on September 3rd, 10th, and 17th, respectively. Just a note for folks who have registered for those sessions, I'll be sending out calendar invites with agendas and background documents about a week in advance of each of the sessions, and also a link to the presentations on our microsite as well. So look out for those calendar invites, and there will be quite a bit of information coming your way. So hopefully they come in time for review in advance, because that's one of the things that we always hear from participants, is that they would like materials for webinar sessions as far in advance as possible. I will share that microsite address here. And with that, we'll turn it to Elder Verna to close.
Hello, everybody. I've just been listening in. I enjoyed the discussions, presentations. I particularly like this First Nation-led environmental assessment, because I look at my own community here, and there's sometimes I think too as well, the traditional knowledge has been so pushed back. But again too as well, but it's still here. And part of our prophecy is that it was that seeking of that knowledge too, because when you're trying to mitigate risk, like in an example, I was thinking like on a road, for example, when I walk, I say, so the roads, the asphalt, for example, is made of bitumen. Where does the bitumen go when the asphalt starts to break down and enter the waterway? Or things like, yes, just simple salting the roads. So when we build roads into new areas, it's not just for, yes, the human consumption, human growth for the economy, but also too as well what the elders would say, and sitting with them throughout the years, is what about the other nations? And that's not just the human nations, it's the ones that fly, the ones that crawl, the four-legged, and so on. So again too as well, I always think about this impact assessment. We also go by this European-led constitution, which was really divvying up our lands into the provinces. And then I said, so who, if we had a First Nation, really, because of the inherent right, the knowledge, Inuit in the north, also the traditional knowledge, what trumps what in terms of the constitution for the provinces, let alone the federal, because for us too, we do not have treaty, but the treaties are based on also nation to nation, and the nation was with the crown, the British crown, the French crown here. So and we still have this wampum belt of the sharing of the lands and resources with the three holding hands, the three figures holding hands. That includes now our system of governance, our system of managing the lands, our original lands here. So it's all that coming in, and our constitution is very different. And we call that Anishinaabe, Omabaninwad, and Okanagan. And it involves also ceremonial process. And it doesn't, so it's very different. But then again, how do you combine that? Because the reality is, look at how much damage we've done. I was just reading a post the other day, maybe also too as well, what would be, I forget what it was, but also too as well, can you actually drink the river? The sign of a prosperous community is that you have a drinkable river. But how do we change our own mindset? The mindset on contact here was that they were just used to dissolve everything. So I think that's where this environmental assessment comes in, but also too as well, like even they were speaking about the irrigation too. We had a different understanding of caretaking of the land. And again, here we are. So again, to who trumps what? And it goes back to this nation to nation understanding. But again, to a lot of our people are still also in a healing awakening mode of what was done to us under this colonization. So we're in that process of sort of turmoil, but we have to learn quick because here we are. And regardless, we all share this earth, and the water connects us all, the air connects us all, the fire of the sun, the fire of the earth connects us all, the earth connects us all. So I say, miigwech, ojeni gashkitochu, monjinon wanoje honje kakinaya pamadasuin. We do question na big deska gisha dan kakina on jenigashkitoju, Mino Pamadsuaj, Kakina Guch, Chiwaniki watch, Enabigis, Kan Sheshquatni Gwede Simene, Ashishkan, Sheshquatni Gwede Simen Kego, Shwen Mishnon, Migwach, 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 Migwach. I say thank you in the four directions, the four seasons, the four stages of your life here. We're all given assignments, and today impact assessment is our assignment. So I think that's where we need to evolve to and grow together. And we've come a long way too as well. But also, I still think too 80% of this contamination is close to First Nations lands these days, because 67% of First Nations communities are in rural, remote locations, and Canada has thrived on this resource extraction. So I think too, how do we bring responsibility back in the 7 grandfather teachings? So all the best to you, and I say miigwech for the conversation today, and I wish you all well. Thank you.
Miigwech, Elder Vernon. Thank you all.